Cassie had stopped trying to keep count of the houses. Suburban streets all looked the same after a while. Low fences, pale siding, trimmed hedges, and windows too clean to reflect anything honest. Her rideshare dropped her off at the corner. She walked the last few feet, heels silent against the concrete. Just another house. Just another night. She rang the bell once. The man who opened the door didn't look like the others. Not leering, not nervous, just quiet. His presence filled the frame, tall and solid, dressed in a black t-shirt and grey sweatpants. His hair was still damp, as if he'd just showered, and he smelled faintly of soap and something else she couldn't place. Clean, but masculine. "Cassie?" he asked. His voice was deep, rough, but not unfriendly. She nodded. "You're Dan." He stepped aside without a word, letting her in. The house was dim, softly lit by a few lamps. Sparse furniture, a leather couch, bookshelves, no television. The place felt lived in, but only barely. She stood near the door, waiting for direction. Most clients like to get to it quickly, rip off the pretense. But Dan just walked over to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, then glanced at her over the rim. "You want anything?" "No, I'm fine," she said. Polite, detached. He didn't look her up and down like others did. Didn't ask for prices or conditions. That had all been handled online. And yet, he made no move. No bedroom. No drink. Just silence. Cassie finally broke it. "So, what do you want tonight?" Dan leaned back against the counter, eyes on her. "I'm not sure yet." She raised an eyebrow. That's usually the part people are very sure about. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You're not what I expected." Meaning, "You're calm, too calm for someone who's supposed to act like she wants to be here." Cassie felt a flicker of annoyance. "I'm not here to act. I'm here to work." "I know." He set the glass down. "Let's go upstairs." Finally, she thought. Routine was better than ambiguity. She followed him up the narrow staircase. The bedroom was large but uncluttered. A made bed, dark wood furniture, heavy curtains half drawn. He gestured toward the edge of the bed and sat down opposite her in the armchair. "Aren't you joining me?" she asked, slipping off her heels. "Eventually," he said. "Tell me something first. Why do you do this?" Cassie blinked. "Seriously?" Dan didn't flinch. "Just curious." Cassie considered lying, like she usually did. Something short, vague, but tonight, something in his tone, or maybe in the silence that wrapped itself around them, made her answer differently. "Because it's simple," she said. "No expectations. No pretending I'm in love. No morning after texts. It's honest in its own way." He nodded slowly. "That's a better answer than I expected." "People usually don't like honest," she added, unzipping the side of her dress. Dan stood up, finally. Crossed the room, reached out, and stopped her hand. "Leave it on." He said. Cassie froze. "You called me for company and don't want me undressed." His fingers skimmed lightly up her arm. Not possessive, just curious. "I want you here. That doesn't mean I want to rush." She swallowed hard. That kind of slowness, real attention, was more intimate than nakedness. Dan brought his mouth close to her ear. Lie back. She did. He didn't undress her. He didn't undress himself. He just lay beside her, one hand moving along the outside of her thigh through the fabric, tracing heat without urgency. Every touch felt deliberate. She was used to men who couldn't wait to be inside her. Dan seemed more interested in everything before that. Cassie's breathing slowed, deepened. Her thighs parted instinctively. His mouth brushed her collarbone, her shoulder, then down, never quite touching the places that ached. It wasn't performance anymore. Her responses weren't practiced. When his fingers finally slipped beneath the hem of her dress, Cassie arched without thinking. One hand gripped the pillow above her head. Her eyes fluttered shut, and she whispered something she hadn't meant to say. "Don't stop." Dan didn't, and when it was over, he didn't say anything. He just lay beside her, one arm under his head, the other resting lightly on her waist. The air between them had changed. Cassie turned her head toward him in the dark. "Do you always do it like this?" Dan looked back at her, his voice low. "Only when I want them to come back." Cassie didn't expect him to call again. That kind of quiet, the kind they'd shared, didn't usually ask for encores. It was rare, and rare things were best left untouched. But 3 days later, just after 9 in the evening, her phone buzzed with a simple message. "Same time?" D. She stared at the screen longer than she meant to. No emojis, no small talk, no begging. Just an open door. She typed back, "Yes." This time, he opened the door in jeans and a dark button-down. No cologne, no cold-blooded stares. Just Dan. The kind of man who made silence feel deliberate, not awkward. "You remembered," he said simply. "I was curious," Cassie answered. "You're not exactly typical, sir." A faint smile curved his lips. "Neither are you." He didn't lead her upstairs. Instead, he gestured toward the kitchen and poured her a glass of wine. Not cheap, but not showy. They stood at opposite ends of the counter, the air between them thick with something unspoken. "Rough night?" he asked. Cassie shrugged. "A few pushy types. One guy wanted me to call him Daddy. I declined." Dan smirked. "That seems fair." "You?" she asked. "Rough day?" He took a sip. "Meetings? Deadlines? The usual. You know, all the ways people pretend they're important." They locked eyes. That dry, slow amusement between them had the feel of foreplay. And still, he didn't touch her. They sat on the couch in his living room, soft jazz playing in the background. Nothing romantic, more ambient than anything. Cassie curled one leg beneath her, fingers around the stem of her glass. "I looked you up," she said suddenly. Dan turned his head. "Did you?" She nodded. "Found your name on some corporate website. Something with numbers and partners and annual growth." He didn't look annoyed. If anything, he looked impressed. "Most people don't care what I do." "I didn't," Cassie replied. "But I wondered who you are when you're not this." Dan leaned back. "And who are you when you're not, Cassie?" She hesitated. "I don't remember." He didn't press. Instead, his hand moved, slow and certain, to her knee. Just rested there, warm, solid, casual. The silence stretched again, and this time it didn't feel like a pause. It felt like the moment before a drop falls. "I don't want to talk anymore." Cassie said. Dan's hand slid higher. Upstairs, she undressed herself, slowly, deliberately facing him. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching her like someone admiring a painting, not a body. Her dress hit the floor. No lingerie tonight, just skin, pale in the lamp's amber glow. Dan rose and approached, still fully clothed. His hands came to rest on her hips. His fingers dug in just enough to make her feel owned. But gently, he kissed her collarbone first, then her throat, then lower. She let out a breath that felt like it had been waiting for days. His mouth found her nipple, tongue flicking once before drawing it in. Cassie's back arched into his hands. He carried her backward onto the bed and didn't stop exploring. Mouth, hands, breath, all over her body. Every place that never got enough attention. The backs of her knees, the curve of her waist, the inside of her wrist. When his tongue slid between her legs, she gasped. Not because of how it felt, but because of how long he stayed there, unhurried, like there was nowhere else in the world he'd rather be. Cassie came hard, toes curling, hands gripping the sheets, hips rising into his face. And when she opened her eyes, Dan was watching her, his lips wet, his breathing heavy. He undressed slowly, never breaking eye contact. When he entered her, it was deep and slow. Not teasing, not performative. Just full, real. She wrapped her legs around him, nails pressing into his shoulders. Their bodies moved together, not like strangers, not even like lovers, like two people who had stopped pretending. He kissed her hard when she came again, and this time she kissed him back. Later, they lay tangled in sheets and sweat, her head on his chest, his hand absently stroking her arm. "Do you do this often?" she asked. He chuckled. "No, I don't hire. I don't repeat. And I don't talk this much." She smiled into his skin. "Then what's this?" Dan exhaled through his nose. "Something else." They didn't speak again that night, but when Cassie left, just before sunrise, she didn't feel paid for. She felt remembered. And as she walked back toward the waiting car, she realized she hadn't checked her phone once. Cassie told herself she wouldn't see him again. Not because she didn't want to, but because she did. Too much. That wasn't safe. There were rules to this life. Invisible lines she'd drawn to protect herself. No repeat visits unless they were high-paying. No overnights unless it was worth the risk. No feeling anything. And Dan was a walking violation of all three. But by Friday night, she was in front of his door again. This time, he didn't greet her with silence. He opened the door, and the scent of something warm and savory drifted out behind him. "You cook?" she asked, stepping inside. Dan gave a small shrug. "Only when I want someone to stay a while." Cassie didn't respond. She didn't need to. They sat at the kitchen island with bowls of pasta and 2 glasses of wine. The lights were dim, but not in a seductive way. It was cozy, soft, normal. She watched him while he talked. Not much, but enough. He asked her about music, books, places she'd been. Not work, not money, not sex. She answered carefully, not because she didn't trust him, but because the truth felt too dangerous. "Why do you keep calling me?" she asked halfway through her wine. Dan looked at her evenly, Because you don't pretend. That's my job, she said wryly. No, he replied. Your job is to perform. You don't. That's why I want you here. Cassie didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever accused her of honesty before. It felt more intimate than anything physical. Later, in the living room, Dan sat beside her on the couch, one hand resting on her thigh. Not urgent, not claiming, just there. A reminder. She turned to him. If you want to fuck me, just say it. He didn't move. I want to fuck you. I also want to talk to you. I also want to sit here and do nothing while you exist next to me. Her breath caught a little at that. Then his fingers moved. Slowly, from her knee to the inside of her thigh, under the hem of her dress. She spread her legs for him, no hesitation. His fingers found her already wet, and when he looked up, the look in his eyes wasn't lust. It was something quieter, something that made her feel seen. Cassie moaned softly as he worked her open with practiced, deliberate touches. No rush, just pressure, rhythm, heat. She leaned into him, forehead against his shoulder. Breath shallow. I should go, she whispered, even as her body betrayed her. You don't want to. No. He pulled his fingers out of her and brought them to her lips. Then don't. They didn't make it to the bedroom. Dan pulled her onto his lap on the couch, her thighs straddling his hips, her hands in his hair. She unzipped his jeans and freed him, hard and hot in her hand. She guided him inside her slowly, moaning into his neck as she sank down. Cassie rocked against him, slow and deep, letting the tension build. Dan's hands gripped her waist, his mouth on her throat. Every movement was deliberate, charged. When she came, it was with a gasp, her head thrown back, hair sticking to her sweat-damp skin. Dan followed seconds later, burying his face in her chest as his body shook beneath her. They stayed like that for a long time, still joined, breath mingling. Afterward, Cassie stood in front of the window, wrapped in one of his shirts, looking out into the quiet suburban night. Dan brought her a glass of water and stood beside her. You're not like the others, he said. You don't know the others, she replied. I don't have to. Cassie looked at him. His eyes were tired, soft around the edges, but clear. This can't become a habit, she said quietly. I know. It's already a habit. He didn't argue. He just took her hand and led her back to bed. And that night, she didn't leave before sunrise. Cassie stopped checking her schedule. Dan never asked in advance anymore. He just texted, "You up? Come over. Made something. You should try it." And she always came. No more talk of money, no more negotiations, just time, unmeasured, bodies uncounted. Some nights they didn't even touch. They'd lie on opposite ends of the couch, legs tangled, music drifting through the background while she read from one of his books, and he stroked her ankle absently. Other nights were pure hunger. Sex against walls, fingers gripping skin hard enough to bruise, teeth finding flesh. It should have scared her, but Cassie couldn't seem to stop. She woke up before him one morning, sun filtering through the curtains in dusty beams. Dan lay on his stomach, one arm stretched out across the sheets, his back bare, rising and falling with each breath. She watched him for a long time. Her own body saw in the best way. In her world, this was the part where she dressed quietly and left, but her clothes were scattered. Dress draped over the chair, panties somewhere under the bed, and her legs felt like jelly. So instead, she stayed. Dan stirred not long after, blinking slowly as he rolled onto his side to face her. "You're still here," he murmured, voice rough with sleep. She gave a crooked smile. "Apparently." He reached out, brushing his fingers along her cheekbone. "You hungry?" "For what?" He laughed. "Eggs, toast, the usual." "Sure," she whispered, still not quite believing how easy it felt. While he cooked, Cassie padded around the house in one of his shirts, barefoot, aimless. She ended up in a side room she hadn't noticed before. Bookshelves lined the walls, but the real centerpiece was a piano. Matted black, clean, untouched. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing. "You play?" came Dan's voice behind her. Cassie jumped a little, then turned. "No, you?" He nodded. "Used to. Haven't touched it in years." "Why?" Dan shrugged. "Too many memories attached to sound." She wanted to ask what that meant. What kind of memories? Who they belonged to? But stopped herself. Some things weren't for sharing. Not yet. That afternoon, while lying together on the couch, Dan broke the silence. "Have you ever thought about quitting?" Cassie froze. "Quitting what?" He turned his head toward her, expression unreadable. "This, the work, everything that comes with it." "I don't think about it," she said flatly. "Why not?" "Because it doesn't matter. It's not a fairy tale. I don't get to just stop and become someone else." Dan didn't push, but the question hung in the air between them like smoke. That night, she took another call. Not from Dan. A new client. Private, expensive, discreet. She told herself it was just work. Like brushing her teeth, paying bills, eating dinner. But his hands were too cold. His apartment smelled like bleach. And the way he kissed her made her want to scrape her mouth clean afterward. She left before the hour was up and didn't take the money. The next day she stood in Dan's bathroom, staring at herself in the mirror. There were faint bruises on her hips from the last time he gripped her too hard. She liked them. They felt like marks of something real. He found her there, still in a towel, hair damp from the shower. He leaned against the doorframe. "You okay?" Cassie nodded. "Just tired." Dan watched her a moment longer. "I don't need you to be anything here. You know that, right?" "I don't know what that even means," she whispered. "It means," he said, walking toward her. "You can just be." They didn't have sex that night. They undressed slowly, climbed into bed, and lay in silence. His hand found hers beneath the covers. Their fingers intertwined. Cassie stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of his breath. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. But she also didn't feel safe. Because whatever this was, it was starting to matter. And that was more dangerous than anything else. Cassie didn't recognize the car at first. It was black, sleek, too polished for this quiet neighborhood. The kind of car that usually belonged to people who didn't knock. She was stepping out of Dan's shower, towel wrapped tight, when she saw it parked outside through the narrow window above the sink. A woman was getting out. Tall, elegant, dark hair pinned in a sharp twist. She moved with the kind of ease Cassie recognized. Confidence born of history. The kind of history she didn't have with Dan, but suspected someone else once did. Her stomach tightened. By the time she made it downstairs, Dan was at the door. Cassie lingered near the stairs, silent, listening. "Clara," Dan said, his tone careful. "It's been a while," the woman replied. Her voice was smooth, deliberate. "You shouldn't be here." "I was passing through," she said, then added, almost playfully, "I didn't expect you to be so domesticated." Dan didn't answer. Cassie leaned further against the wall, still hidden. Clara continued, "I heard about your father. I'm sorry." Dan's voice was flat. "Thanks." A pause. "And the girl upstairs?" Silence. Cassie could hear her own heartbeat now. "She's not your type," Clara said softly. "Too real." Something in Dan's tone changed. "You don't know anything about her." Cassie pulled back, barefoot on the stairs. The towel felt suddenly too thin, her presence too fragile. She retreated to the bedroom without a sound. Dan found her later, dressed, and pretending to scroll her phone. She didn't look up as he entered. "You heard," he said. Cassie shrugged. "I wasn't trying to." He sat at the edge of the bed. "She's no one." "You loved her once." "Yes." There was no hesitation, no denial. Cassie looked up, finally meeting his eyes. "So why did she come back?" Dan rubbed a hand over his face. "Because she could. Because she knows I'll open the door. That's the kind of power you get when you leave someone without warning." "Why did she leave?" He didn't answer. Cassie stood, crossing the room. "You told her I was too real. Is that true?" Dan caught her wrist gently. "She said that. I didn't." "But you didn't argue either." He stood closer now. "I've been trying not to feel anything for years, Cass. You make that impossible." The silence between them turned hot, electric. Not anger, not desire. Something rawer. She moved first. They didn't undress each other this time. There was no ceremony. Dan pressed her against the wall, mouth hungry, hands greedy. Cassie clawed at his shirt, yanking it over his head as he kicked the bedroom door shut. His jeans hit the floor with a thud. She wasn't sure if she wanted to hurt him or hold him. When he entered her, it was rough, fast. Their bodies slammed together, the rhythm wild, messy. Cassie bit his shoulder hard enough to leave marks. He pinned her wrists above her head and drove into her like he was trying to bury every word Clara had said. She cried out, and he kissed her to muffle the sound. When they came, it was near simultaneous. Violent, staggering, shaking. Afterward, they collapsed into bed, tangled and sweat-slick. Dan pulled her against his chest, breathing ragged. "You're not her," he whispered. Cassie closed her eyes. "I know." But deep down, she wasn't sure if that was a comfort or a curse. She stayed the night. In the morning, Clara was gone. No note, no trace. Cassie made coffee while Dan stood shirtless in the doorway, watching her. "You regret last night?" she asked. Dan shook his head. "No." "But you're thinking." I'm always thinking. Cassie leaned on the counter. Then tell me what you want from me. For real. Dan walked over, took her chin in his hand, and kissed her softly. Nothing like the night before. It was quiet, steady. I want you to stay. She blinked. For today. For as long as it feels right. Cassie looked down at the mug between her hands. And if it stops feeling right? Then we talk. Or we don't. But I won't disappear. She wasn't sure she believed that. But she wanted to. Later that day, she checked her old messages. Missed bookings. Requests. 2 new clients offering double her rate. She deleted them all. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel like a worker off the clock. She felt like someone who might be learning how to live again. Cassie didn't go back to work. Not officially, not publicly. Her profile stayed up for a while. A safety net she couldn't quite let go of. But the messages came and went unanswered. At first, it felt like holding her breath underwater, waiting to see if Dan would change his mind. If he'd pull away. If it would all vanish the moment it got too real. But he didn't. He stayed. And that scared her more than anything else. They developed a rhythm, one that didn't have a name. She started leaving things at his house. A toothbrush. A sweater. One morning, her phone charger was already plugged in by the bed, like he'd expected her to stay. She cooked sometimes, not because he asked, but because she wanted to. Dan wasn't much for words, but he noticed everything. He'd press a kiss to the back of her neck when she washed dishes, leave her notes on the bathroom mirror, pick up her favorite art snacks without being told. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't distance anymore. It was comfort. Cassie found herself smiling at things that weren't supposed to matter. The way he always folded towels, the sound of him shuffling barefoot through the hallway, the warmth of his chest behind her in the middle of the night. But it wasn't a fairy tale. Not yet. One afternoon she caught herself sitting on the front steps, sunlight on her legs, watching the wind move through the trees. No makeup, no earrings, just her. And the thought came, sharp and sudden. Is this happiness? She wasn't sure, but it was something close. That night, after dinner, Dan brought her into the piano room. She paused in the doorway. You never play. He walked past her, sat down at the bench. Doesn't mean I forgot how. She stepped closer. He looked up at her, expression unreadable. Sit with me? She sat beside him, hip to hip, shoulder against his. He started slow, fingers hesitant, then smoother. The notes were low, warm, slightly out of tune, but beautiful in their imperfection. Cassie closed her eyes. He didn't play a full song, just a handful of chords, then silence. Dan turned his head. My mother used to sit here while I played. She'd hum along. I haven't touched it since she passed. Cassie swallowed. Why now? He looked at her. Because for the first time in a long time, this house doesn't feel empty. Her throat tightened. She leaned into him, pressing her lips to his jaw. They didn't go upstairs. They made love right there on the piano bench. Slow, almost reverent. No words, just hands, breath, weight. When it was over, he held her against him, both of them half-dressed, her legs still draped across his lap. and she whispered, "I think I'm falling for you." Dan didn't flinch, didn't pretend not to hear. He rested his chin on her head and said simply, "I already did." Weeks passed. She cancelled her ad, deleted the app, erased her history. The first time Dan noticed, he didn't say anything, just pulled her closer under the sheets that night, kissing her shoulder as she drifted to sleep. One morning, she woke up before him, sunlight bright across the bed. She slipped out of his shirt, pulled on her jeans, walked barefoot to the front door. Not to leave, but just to feel the air, to breathe. She stood there for a long time, toes on the cool stone, coffee in her hand, the breeze soft on her face. This house, this man, this stillness. It wasn't what she planned. It wasn't safety, but it was hers now. And when she went back inside, Dan was waiting in the kitchen, coffee already poured for her, smile slow and soft on his face. "You always wake up this early?" she asked. "Only when I don't want to miss you." Cassie walked to him, leaned up on her toes and kissed him. Not to start something, not to seduce, just because she could. Just because she stayed.